Imagine standing beside someone you love. They take one final breath. Then, silence. Now imagine living 100,000 years ago. No hospitals, no priests, no written language. Only a small group of humans trying to survive another day. Yet, instead of walking away, they stopped. They dug into the earth and they placed the body inside. Then they covered it with soil. That simple act changed human history forever. But why? Why would people struggling to stay alive spend precious time burying the dead? The answer begins long before cities, long before farming, even before civilization itself. Death is not unique to humans. Every animal dies. Many animals recognize death. Elephants have been seen touching the bones of dead relatives. Chimpanzees sometimes stay beside the bodies of their infants for days. Crows gather around their dead in what scientists call crow funerals. But almost no other species deliberately buries its dead. So what changed in us? To understand that, we need to travel deep into the Ice Age. Around 120,000 years ago, small groups of humans wandered across Africa and the Middle East. Every day was a battle. Finding food was uncertain. Predators waited in the darkness. Injuries often meant death. Time was the most valuable resource anyone had, so digging a grave made no practical sense, unless it served a purpose greater than survival. For decades, archaeologists searched for the earliest evidence. One remarkable discovery came from a cave in Israel. At a site called Zgul Cave, researchers uncovered human skeletons buried roughly 100,000 years ago. The bodies were carefully placed. Some were lying on their backs. Others had objects buried beside them. These were not accidents. Someone had taken time to prepare the dead. Another extraordinary discovery came from Kafse Cave. One grave contained the remains of a child. Placed across the child's chest were the antlers of a red deer. No one knows exactly why. Perhaps it was a gift, perhaps it was a symbol, or perhaps it meant something we can no longer understand. Whatever the reason, it was intentional. And intention changes everything. Burial is more than moving a body. It requires planning. It requires cooperation. Most importantly, it requires thought about someone who is no longer alive. That may seem ordinary today, but in human evolution, it was revolutionary. Researchers believe this reflects something called symbolic thinking, the ability to let one object represent another idea. A flower can represent love. A flag can represent a nation. A grave can represent memory. Without symbolic thought, civilizations could never exist. Neither could religion, nor art, nor written language. The famous archaeologist Stephen Midden argued that advanced imagination helped transform early human societies. Instead of living only in the present, humans began thinking about the past and imagining the future. Death suddenly became more than the end of a heartbeat. It became a mystery that demanded an answer. Did something continue after death? Could the dead still protect the living? Would they return? No fossil can answer those questions. But graves leave clues. Many ancient burials include objects with no survival value. Stone tools, animal bones, shell beads, pigments like red ochre. Red ochre appears again and again in prehistoric graves. Some researchers believe it symbolized blood. Others think it represented rebirth. No one knows for certain, but people carried it over long distances. That means it mattered. It mattered enough to use in death, which means death itself had become meaningful. That was a turning point in human history. For the first time, people were not simply reacting to nature. They were creating rituals. Rituals bind communities together. They reduce fear. They give meaning to loss. Even today, funerals serve the same purpose. They remind the living they are not alone. Perhaps the first grave was never about the dead at all. Perhaps it was created for those left behind. Because when someone disappears forever, The greatest burden belongs to the people who remain. And somewhere in that silent moment, humanity began to change. That change did not happen overnight. It unfolded over tens of thousands of years. As human communities grew, so did their rituals. Burials became more careful, more personal, and more meaningful. One of the most fascinating discoveries comes from Shanidar Cave in present-day Iraq. There, archaeologists uncovered the remains of several Neanderthals. One individual had survived extraordinary injuries. His right arm had been badly damaged. He likely lost sight in one eye. His hearing was probably impaired. He walked with difficulty. Yet he lived for many years after those injuries. Researchers believe he could not have survived alone. Others must have shared food, protected him from danger, and cared for him when he could no longer care for himself. When he finally died, he was buried. Whether flowers were placed around his body is still debated among scientists. But one fact remains remarkable. Someone believed his body deserved care even after life had ended. That changes how we see Neanderthals. For generations, they were portrayed as brutal creatures. Modern archaeology tells a different story. They hunted, they crafted tools, they cared for one another, and they may have mourned their dead. Compassion did not suddenly appear with modern civilization. Its roots reach far deeper into our past. As thousands of years passed, burial practices became increasingly complex. People began placing valuable objects inside graves. Weapons rested beside skilled hunters. Jewelry accompanied loved ones. Food was buried for journeys no one could prove existed. Some graves contained children wrapped with extraordinary care. Others belonged to leaders surrounded by precious possessions. These discoveries reveal something profound. The dead were no longer seen as empty bodies. They still held meaning. Eventually, graves became monuments. Across Egypt, enormous pyramids rose above the desert. In Europe, stone tombs were built from massive rocks weighing several tons. Across Asia, burial traditions evolved into elaborate ceremonies honoring ancestors. Different cultures chose different rituals. Some buried, some cremated, some placed bodies in caves. Others returned them to the sky or the sea. The methods changed. The purpose remained remarkably similar: to remember, to honor, to say goodbye. Psychologists believe rituals help reduce uncertainty. When people face events they cannot control, the human brain searches for patterns, for meaning, for something familiar. Death offers none of those things. A funeral cannot erase grief, but it can make grief bearable. It reminds us that loss is shared, that no one suffers alone. Perhaps that explains why nearly every known human society developed funeral traditions. Not because people agreed on what happens after death, but because they agreed on what should happen before the living move forward. Even today, despite science explaining so much about the human body, death remains one of life's greatest mysteries. We know how the heart stops, we know how the brain shuts down. But we still ask the same question our ancestors asked around ancient fires. What happens next? No discovery has answered it. Perhaps none ever will. Yet every grave tells us something we do know. Someone lived, someone laughed, someone loved, someone mattered enough that another person stopped everything just to say goodbye. That simple act separates humans from almost every other species. We remember those who are gone. We tell their stories. We preserve their names. We build monuments. We visit graves decades later, sometimes centuries later. Not because the dead can hear us, but because memory shapes who we are. Every cemetery is more than a resting place. It is a library without books. Every stone marks a life that once changed the world in ways we may never fully understand. The first humans who buried their dead probably never imagined that scientists would one day uncover their graves. Yet those silent burials became messages across thousands of generations. They tell us that intelligence alone did not build civilization. Neither did strength nor language. Civilization began the moment humans chose compassion over convenience, the moment they paused, the moment they remembered, the moment they refused to let a life disappear without meaning. Perhaps the first grave was never just a place for the dead. Perhaps it was the first monument to love. And perhaps that is why, after more than 100,000 years, we are still burying our dead today.